Hello, you're listening to ShadowTalk. Typically on this show, we focus on the stories that impact the threat intelligence industry week by week. However, in this special episode, we look at the industry at a macro level, delving into the stories and themes that have changed how we communicate, how we work securely, but also what the future of remote working looks like. In the UK and across the world, remote working has become for many the new norm. But I guess how prepared were organizations for this change? Likewise, on the supplier side, were the technologies such as video communications, ISP providers prepared for this? And what does the future of work look like now? So in this episode, I'm very pleased to have the special guest, Steve Marshall, CISO and Head of Cyber Consulting at Bytes, a software licensing reseller and IT security services. Steve Marshall is a world-class consultant and business executive that has a focus on high-profile projects for the government and leading commercial organizations. Steve specializes in business consulting, payments, compliance, and much, much more, which we will come to later in this podcast. Joining Steve, we also have James Chappell, Digital Shadows' co-founder and chief innovations officer. So Steve and James both join me today to talk about remote working security, data security, and much, much more. So welcome, both of you.
Hello. How are you doing?
How are you both doing today?
I'm all right. I'm enjoying another day in the COVID cave. It's it's all right. It's actually, I'm quite enjoying working from home, if I'm honest. It's different, but definitely quite a lot of benefits to it.
More of the norm for me. I work from wherever my laptop and my phone are anyway, so it kind of doesn't matter to me.
Oh, nice. Well, yeah, I think everyone's sort of adjusting to the new norm, which is good, I guess. And I think in terms of looking at it from like a organizational perspective, you know, at Digital Shadows, this has been set up for us quite nicely, I guess, for remote working. We've also been publishing quite a lot of content around remote working, the future of it. And I think we've definitely had our own perspective on it. But I think what's particularly nice about this episode is that we have you, Steve, to kind of give your perspective, I guess, more of a fresh perspective, and to kind of just get stuck in with this area. I think it'd be quite nice to sort of talk about, this whole era of new remote working, you know, especially because we're kind of 7 weeks plus deep into it right now. As I said, it's kind of the new norm. But I guess if we kind of rewind a few weeks, you know, remote working wasn't like the new norm. It wasn't the norm for many organizations. And I guess, you know, how many organizations were actually prepared to take on this new form of working?
Certainly, and it's a really interesting question because, you know, I think most companies have had some form of remote working ability for some of their users. Some more than others. Some allow remote working. Some only allow particular individuals to remote work. It's interesting because there's kind of been a popular joke on Twitter going around that suggests that COVID-19 is driving digital transformation faster than many CEOs or CTOs have been able to manage. And it's kind of quite amusing in the regard that it's taken something like this actually to push people outside of the office and for people to actually go, okay, so now effectively we're invoking our DR or our BCP solution, which is people aren't in the office, they're working remotely, and actually then testing that at scale. And there's kind of been two kind of real camps in terms of what people have looked at doing in terms of change and ability to adopt and these types of things. Some have adopted at scale in terms of cloud adoption, because cloud adoption clearly has been driven and all the cloud providers have seen a significant increase in capacity and demand and these types of things, because it's actually really, really quick to be able to adopt the cloud right now rather than having to buy an appliance, configure it, ship it to a data center, you know, when everybody's out of the office the following day. You know, it's very difficult to get an appliance that quickly, put it in and actually increase your ability. Other companies have stripped out services, optimized and just increased license count. in terms of standard firewalls that they've got and these types of things in order to optimize and save their business in reality. And what we've really kind of seen is companies that have either really kind of strived and really increased their capacity rapidly by adoption of cloud and optimization, and others have really struggled and had to go out and find additional technology and services and these types of things in order to be able to work from home. And others have got systems where they just can't work from home, so they've had people going in and out of the office on on odd days of the week because some of their systems, the old green screen style technology, just hasn't got the capability to work remotely.
I guess people are on sort of different stages of that journey when it hit, right? And you're seeing the impact of where they were on that journey of sort of moving to more digitally transform. And I really like your point, Steve, about maybe this virus has done more for digital transformation than any CIO. I really like that. So, I mean, it's true. Necessity drives innovation, doesn't it? And sometimes crisis drives innovation as well. I'm sort of quite curious about how many people have actually used it as a time to swap to a new way of working, but without really thinking through some of the consequences of that. So, for example, previously storing all their documents on a drive inside a network, realizing their network doesn't have the capacity, and then switching on some sort of cloud-based file system without really considering it. Have you seen any of that?
Yeah, we've seen quite a lot of that. Unfortunately, we've seen that on both sides of the business. We've seen it on the side of people doing it and kind of making it work, putting it into cloud and getting it going. And then we've seen, unfortunately, the other side in our forensics department where people have hastily put up remote desktop servers open to the internet into their premises, and the forensics guys have been pretty much solidly busy investigating compromises of RDP, unfortunately. And unfortunately, rapid adoption, I think we're starting to see the bow wave now. There was a note that came out today about two construction companies that have been compromised in the UK and another one in France in February. And I think unfortunately, we're going to be on the bow wave of this now, where people have rapidly put up a lot of technology. In our own company, we have pen testing division as well as digital forensics and consulting. Pen testing fell off a cliff in April, huge amounts of bookings to almost zero, because people were rapidly adopting technology, putting it in, and they just didn't have the capability to test and to actually check that it was put in properly. Now we get into May, and actually, we're 150% busy again, and we just don't have capacity because everybody's gone through that phase of shoveling everything in, and now they're in the phase of testing it. The problem is with that lag, we're really on a bow wave of where a whole bunch of technology has probably already been compromised, and people are only now, when they start bedding it in and monitoring it and doing things properly with it, that we're going to start to see a whole bunch of compromises come out.
It's interesting. I wonder, another sort of aspect of this is the sort of scale. So I guess if you think most workforces maybe had, even digital companies, only sort of 30-40% of the workforce were consistently remote. Now 100% are consistently remote. Do we think, I mean, I've heard stories about people having to provision VPNs very quickly. I've heard stories about people having to order in capability or struggling to make their businesses function at all. So where, for example, they have call centers or call answering capabilities, that's made things very, very difficult. Trying to do these things at scale maybe worked for the 20%, but now you've got 100%. Have you seen sort of issues coming out of that?
Yeah, there's been quite a few. I mean, if you look at a lot of the, if you phone up most companies that have standard call center type facilities, everyone you phone pretty much says, yeah, we're really busy, we're taking a huge vast volume of calls, and we'll kind of get back to you. That does seem to be settling down now, and I think a lot of, especially when it comes to the adoption of voice-based technologies in the wide area, most companies are probably not set up, especially contact centers where they have large on-prem PBX technology deployed locally. In a lot of cases, they're just not set up, even though they've got SIP and these types of things in there. They're just not set up to work in a wide area network style with network quality issues and largely things like monitoring and this type of stuff. It also depends on the sensitivity of the work that they're also handling. It's very much a case of some companies where it's very sensitive of just shut the service down. And we'll talk more about that later when we look at some of the privacy aspects of some of the things like Zoom and other video conferencing solutions. But some companies have done quite well. Barclays, I know, have pushed out at scale into remote operating base, and they've actually been talking about do they go back to their main buildings? I think their CEO described their new building in central London as his mausoleum. And they're looking to move pretty much a good portion of their workforce outside and actually start to put people within their local branches and that kind of stuff in call center positions, as well as working at home. And the technology's there. The thing is, all the mainstream manufacturers of big scale digital phone systems and these types of things have the capability for wide area working. They have the ability to be able to do wide area analytics and data mining and those types of things, and voice pattern recognition to make sure that the agent is the person that you've actually employed to do the job, and they haven't subcontracted it out to their friend down the road who's a few quid cheaper. We've seen that in the past where things like voice analytics, voice recognition, and those types of things weren't in place in order to make sure that the person you'd hired was actually the person doing the work.
Very interesting. Identity obviously becomes a big problem when everybody's remote as well, doesn't it? So just a voice on the end of the phone, how do you know it is who they say it is? I guess crisis is sort of a very interesting time for social engineering and people sort of duping others into doing things they don't want. So for example, one of the things we've been looking at is how crisis communications have been spoofed by actors, and how that has then, because people are trying to respond quickly, they're maybe not as thorough as when they're receiving a communication and land up responding to something that they thought was genuine but actually wasn't. You might actually think an IT team in crisis would set up a new domain, or might set up something that looks a little bit unusual to help a business operate more fully, so people are maybe a bit more trusting of something that looks a bit odd. So we've certainly recorded some of that in some of the research we've been doing. It's a fascinating topic.
I think it also goes to the fact that it's the difference in characterization between people that have worked at home previously or for a reasonable length of time versus people that are used to being in the office and then just thrown into that situation. And I think that the two groups of people generally react very differently to the process of being, put into home. The group that works usually in the office and is happy in the office and doesn't really want to work outside of that environment, potentially finds it difficult because they struggle with space at home. It's not the most comfortable or easy situation to work in. There's possibly a lot of distractions going on around them as well, with other people and kids and these types of things, and the guy that was on the TV, the scientist that was on the TV, where his kids pop into the background, how long ago was that? Has become the absolute hero of Zoom users these days.
I believe there's a Zoom background available of that of that background with the kid coming through the door, isn't there? So
yeah, it's awesome. You know, it's brilliant when you look at those types of things. But I think those types of people that are thrown into that situation where the world is suddenly chaos for them, you know, are likely to react very, very differently than people that are fundamentally used to, you know, working in those types of environments.
I wonder though, I saw someone who's always worked from home recently, and they commented to me, even though I've worked from home for a long time, I feel like the cadence of work that we're conducting is still higher paced than from what we were previously. And I wonder whether some of those folks who are more used to it, and I totally agree with you, they're definitely better cut out to cope with this situation, right? But I wonder whether there's also, you know, a feeling, you know, businesses that are in a difficult economic environment are feeling the pressure, and it raises that cadence of work, and perhaps even those that are more cut out for this style of working also feel that pressure as well, and maybe might be influenced. But I don't know. I'm not sure if either of you've seen any of that, but it's I thought that was an interesting observation.
So Microsoft has done a survey of its engineers, of its office engineers. And what they found was that, you know, generally they work in an office and those types of things, and they've measured, you know, how long they're online for, and what the work productivity is, and those types of things. And what they found is that engineers are starting work earlier because they're not traveling. There's not the dip at lunchtime that there was, right? And they tend to be working later into the evening because of the fact that they don't have to travel home as well. So one of the things with the productivity increases, so lots of businesses have seen massive productivity increases, right? What we don't know yet, and more measurement is required, is that because people are not doing the commute, therefore they're working anyway and working through lunch as well. So productivity naturally goes up because you might have an extra 3 hours of work online a day by an individual, or actually has the quality of work gone up? You know, you need to measure the two. And I think the next question, you know, is depending on how much longer we're working from home for, the next question has to be about the employee experience, and actually businesses helping individuals manage their experience and manage their quality and manage their balance.
It's a culture thing in some respects.
It's wide area culture.
Yeah.
And you know, I've run teams all across the UK and Africa and all sorts of places over the years, and it's difficult in order to, you know, to run people at scale remotely, you know. And I think a lot of companies, you know, just aren't used to doing that, you know. And it's interesting because we see a huge increase for, you know, software to look at what individuals are actually doing, you know, how they're doing it. And, you know, on the good side, you could say, yeah, absolutely, employee quality, employee experience, helping individuals manage their time and those types of things. On the bad side, you know, it's corporate spyware at its worst, you know, in terms of seeing how long somebody's actually been sat at their computer, what they've exactly been doing, how they've been doing it, what other websites they viewed in the minutiae of detail in order to be able to manage them.
It's sort of quite a neat example of one of the complaints that was brought against Zoom. In fact, one of the criticisms of video conferencing platforms was that they contain such tools as to establish, you know, how long people are away from a camera, or you know, whether or not they had the cameras on, or you know, exactly how it was configured. So yeah, it's interesting to see that part of the conversation around video conferencing more generally.
Certainly.
I think Vic, we were going to have a bit of a chat about video conferencing, weren't we?
Yeah, exactly. That's actually quite a nice segue. I think, yeah, as we just touched on, we've just looked at how the security architecture may be changing in this new era. But I guess one of the tools in particular that's been helping us, I guess, achieve remote working is Zoom. And I think, yeah, it would be nice to kind of go into detail, like not just Zoom specifically, but I guess those suppliers overall, like how prepared were they, I guess, to kind of enter this new world?
It's certainly been fraught, hasn't it? So I've noticed that, you know, we've had a variety. We used to have, we were at one point with all of our client base of people fairly accepting of one particular platform that we were using, and all of a sudden overnight that changed, and we went from a position where you could, you know, have one type of software to have those meetings with your customers, to having customers where we've got probably about 5 different types of platform that they're mandating that I'm only going to meet with you if you're using this other platform over here.
Yeah.
And it's been, for a business like ours, you know, we're having to ensure we're meeting our customers' requirements. Some of them have demanded staying on sort of older platforms as well. So it's been a really fascinating experience for us. Fascinating in slightly painful sense, but it's quite. It sort of made me ask some sort of sensible questions. There's clearly some very legitimate concerns about platforms like Zoom, which we can get into in a minute. It's quite interesting. Services like WebEx. Actually, some of the folks who set up Zoom used to work at WebEx, and you know, but I found customers reverting back to sort of things like WebEx. Microsoft Teams seem to have grown out of, you know, relative obscurity to quite a strong platform. We're seeing people like, we see their TV adverts, see people like the Metropolitan Police sort of appearing on there, and we know that in the sort of government debacle, we saw Boris Johnson on a Zoom call, and then also saying, "Oh, we use Microsoft Teams for our really secure stuff." You know, there's a there's a debate there, and then other people sort of moving on to platforms like Citrix GoToMeeting and others beside it, some of which OEM some of the previous technologies. So it's gone from what was fairly consistent, everybody knew where they were, that was all fine, to it's a complete chaos. How do we sort this out?
Yeah, and it's always a difficult one, right? Because everybody has their own kind of pet favorites in terms of what they like to use, and I think you know, Zoom probably has been picked on the most, and I kind of both feel sorry for them and kind of not sorry for them as well, in equal measure, because, you know, I think if you look at where they started, they were a marketing company, right? And they've done a fantastic job at marketing the features that they've got. Therefore, everybody's piled onto the platform because of the fact that you can have, you know, lots and lots of video on the screen at the same time, lots of usability and those types of things. And everybody's kind of, you know, popped into that, and in terms of, you know, buying the marketing message that's come with it. So in terms of that, that's great. But what I don't kind of buy from them is the fact that, you know, they knew there were issues with the platform. They knew some of the things that they were saying were inaccurate or potentially misleading, in terms of encryption, which they've now come out and clarified. There's been a number of major bugs, but then again, we kind of expect that. You know, the more scrutiny something gets, the more bugs you find, ultimately, and the more popular it becomes, the more people research it and have a go at them. The biggest problem that I have is that, you know, there's ultimately, when you bake this down, there's no reason to write secure software. None, right? Let's be honest about this. People are more interested in features and getting it quickly than they are anything else, and that drives the market. So it's the old project management triangle, right? Cost, time, quality. Pick any two, right? Yeah. You know, if you want it quickly and you want it cheaply, you don't get quality, right? And that's where most software production is at the moment. It's an arms race of feature richness as quickly as you possibly can get it out there, so you can win more market share, and then you deal with the security aspects afterwards.
It's quite interesting if you compare that. So if you look at people like Microsoft, who went through completely re-engineering their software development lifecycle, and so they introduced the three security bugs and you're fired culture.
Yep.
in their business, and they turned around what was a products that were underinvested in from a security point of view into probably some of the most robust security products in the world as a result. It seems that, I wonder whether some of the debate on video conferencing platforms have not taken into account the fact that a business can go on a journey like that. And I think some would argue that Zoom, and probably I would argue as well, actually, that Zoom has been on that journey, both from suddenly giving it a focus that it didn't have before, through to very quickly rolling out some features which were really, I don't think I've known security features to come into place as quickly as they rolled those ones out. It's phenomenally quick, to establishing someone at the top of their organization with reputation of helping organizations who've been through a transition. So Alex Stamos, obviously, who joined Zoom to assist with that. And I'm sort of, if we focus on the outcome for the user and the users of their products, I kind of feel like they've probably in a much better place from where they were, right?
Let me throw a slightly different slant on that, right? So I agree, they're starting to do the right things, right? And Microsoft went through all that pain and had the same, had the same issues, came to the conclusion that they needed to spend more, so they did. And actually, they've got themselves into a position where they've got a very, very robust security and software development lifecycle, and are actually doing a really good job, in my opinion. Zoom, I agree. They're putting out lots of security fixes. They're dealing with the negative publicity that they're getting and these types of things. However, I did a bit of research around the fringes of the internet for the last couple of days, and I discovered Zoom sex parties, right? Not from participating. I hasten to add, this was a purely research-driven effort. I looked at those because, whenever you get that type of area of proclivity, you always find there's lots of questions being asked and whether it's legitimate or not. So the Zoom privacy policy states that they don't monitor video feeds or audio feeds or these types of things. Okay, great. However, one of their representatives told Rolling Stone that the app uses a mix of tools, including machine learning, to pick up nudity, pornography, and sexually explicit material, right? Because they have requirements under US legislation in order to protect participants of child exploitation and all sorts of things within their platform. Therefore, they have to be able to identify that and report it to the appropriate authorities. Now, if you're suggesting to me that they have controls in place as their representative has suggested to Rolling Stone, that means that they must be looking inside the video content in order to be able to find breaches of their privacy policy for nudity, pornography, or explicit material, right? That means that they're in breach of their privacy policy, and they have to be looking at the video streams via the middle channel.
Right. So they could encrypt. They have to encrypt, decrypt, and re-encrypt.
Well, it's not end to end, right?
Yeah.
So at the moment, you're encrypted from the client to their server,
Yeah.
and then from their server to the other client. So you've got that bit in the middle where you can run whatever you like, in terms of either recording or in terms of machine learning or video analytics or any of those types of things on that.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a really interesting statement. So I guess we obviously saw Zoom buy Keybase as a company, and there was the New York Attorney General's office brought about an action relating to the strength of the encryption on the platform as well. And I understand sort of whether or not those two things are correlated or not, people can debate, but there was a legal action and an acquisition of a company that would improve encryption infrastructure occurred. but that still doesn't address the concern you just raised, right?
Correct. I mean, for me, I honestly believe that Zoom is starting to do the right things, right? I think they've been thrust into the spotlight, very, very quickly. And to be fair, their reaction has been exceptionally good, in terms of, starting to address issues that have been raised, going and hiring somebody at a senior level in order to take responsibility and accountability for this and dealing with things. I think their biggest problem at the moment is that, they need to look at things like the privacy policy. They need to look at, the information that they're portraying about the way they do certain things and what they've said. If you look at others like, Facebook and bits and pieces, they've said, yeah, it's not end-to-end encrypted. They've never made that claim. They're also quite clear that, they do have a team of people that look at, offensive material and these types of things, and have a very large team. The interesting thing is, though, that Facebook has sent their monitoring team home because of the fact that they believe that it's too sensitive to do that outside of a monitored and structured environment. And, the damage could be too great to, or temptation too great to individuals to do that. So they've moved to machine learning and AI, which has increased their false positive rate, almost exponentially in that regard. So I don't think there's any easy answers, and that's why I say I'm kind of both, sympathetic and a bit non-sympathetic to Zoom, because I think they're doing the right things. They just keep shooting themselves in the foot occasionally with not getting themselves tied up at both sides.
I think is it worth saying that lots of other, obviously it's not the only choice of video conferencing platform
Certainly
out
not.
There are others out there, right? And I think I like the fact that everybody's asked some really legitimate questions of what they're doing, and it's I think it's always a good time to ask a question about security or privacy of an app that you're using. I think probably though other platforms also have problems, and I don't think you'd ever find one single perfect platform, right?
I think actually, JC, so on the Shadow Talk podcasts previously, we've discussed how there are quite a few elements to this. So I guess in some sense, Zoom, as we've touched on here just now as well, that Zoom has kind of had this imbalance perhaps of reporting where it's got a lot of, I guess, deserved attention at times, but in terms of reporting, it's got the frequency at which people are reporting is quite high. And then you've also got on the other side of that, like as Steve touched on, the people actually testing the platform and finding the vulnerabilities and the weaknesses within it. And I wonder if in that sense as well, there's an imbalance in the hunting, the aspect of discovering these vulnerabilities. So you've got the media attention, and then you've got the actual discovery of these weaknesses. And unfortunately, it seems to be a victim of both in that sense. And that's something we've touched on before, yeah.
It's been a victim of its own success, right? Just in the way Microsoft was back in the day with all the attention, just in exactly the same way things like Apache and are on the internet with web services. The most popular options that people choose are the ones that are targeted, right? Because you get the mass populace. It's the same now. You're starting to see more Mac OS being used. Therefore, you start to see Mac OS viruses, being produced. And this is what happens is that, of course, as a criminal, you're clearly going to follow, the areas that are most popular because you've got the biggest demographic to hit and monetize. And it's the same, popularity, drives security researchers' interest. It derives, increased scrutiny and those types of things. And the more, publicity and press and everything else you've got around a subject, the more hype you get, and everybody jumps on the bandwagon, including me. But I have to say, there are other platforms. I use a whole multitude of platforms. As long as you understand the context and the risk of what you've got, fine. And as long as it's, it's the sensitivity of what you're discussing is appropriate, great.
Build yourself a threat model, align your controls around it.
Perfect.
Yeah. I think also just on top of that, so in terms of, we know that Zoom has received a lot of scrutiny, but I guess in terms of other technologies that have supported our remote working is sort of ISP providers. And at a macro level, I guess, remote working has definitely tested the resiliency of our national infrastructure. And I wonder how, as a country, I guess specifically the UK, how prepared are we to move the workers back home rather than in the office?
For me, I think we've actually done reasonably well, to be honest, as a country. I mean, depending on the stats, Cloudflare's suggesting their traffic's up 5%. The general internet traffic suggests website and news traffic is up about 30 to 60%, and online gaming's up 20%. Vodafone in the UK saw a 30% increase in its UK traffic and 50% in some other EU countries. We've seen a few outages. There was a Virgin outage last week that was reasonably significant for a period of time. We've seen outages on O2 and those types of things as well. The interesting thing with this is that, there has been a general increase, but, they're suggesting on average, internet traffic grows 30 to 40% per annum anyway, right? So actually, this year it may be 40 to 50% increase in traffic. But I think one of the things that's saved the UK generally is the fact that we don't have widespread 5G, so we haven't got widespread, broadband mobile connectivity, and we don't have, as big a presence in high bandwidth residential fiber as other countries. Therefore, actually, the volume of traffic from home locations is depressed significantly more than it would be in other countries like South Korea and potentially, patches of the US and that type of stuff, where they've had a huge amount more issues with outage and with problems. I think one of the best things, for the ISPs, is if you look at Glastonbury as a model, right? EE put up infrastructure at Glastonbury, every year. They get more and more visitors. There's more and more data density on fewer and fewer cells. And if you listen to the guy that sets it up, he says, well, as an ISP, how do we test this at scale without actually doing it live? Right? We can only do it live. So in that regard, actually, COVID's been a mass test of wide area broadband, cabinet infrastructure, POPs into cores, and actually it survived pretty well.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's been fascinating. I was really worried the first week. I was like, when are the outages coming? I'm just waiting for the outages, and I was delighted by the fact I didn't see that many. We've got quite a few colleagues that work in more rural settings, so they're part of the not massively quick rural broadband rollout that's been happening over the last sort of 5-6 years. Some of them are, one of my friends moved 2 doors away from the cabinet and lost over 10 megaseconds in speed. But even he has been able to keep on top of things. He's still able to join video conferences. He's still able to participate. So I've actually been quite surprised, I think, by just how robust it has been. And I think we're now thinking, I mean, a lot of people are thinking that there's some discussions about folks not going back to offices this year. And I think businesses, if you look at like Twitter, they've just announced that, well, all employees can sort of work from home for forever if they wish. People are rethinking about, where do I live? This actually is now viable in a way that we didn't think it was before, and it's been a big proving point. So it's quite interesting. It's very sad to see OneWeb, the sort of satellite internet infrastructure business, unfortunately didn't quite make it, but there are a bunch of satellites up above Europe at the moment that will be providing internet for whomever acquires those. I think the UK government currently own those satellites at the moment, but somebody's probably going to buy those. You've seen Elon Musk's Starlink program going on to provide similar services in the Americas. Suddenly, we are now in this era where we passed the big experiment. there is this actually an opportunity to change the way that we work. And I think a lot of businesses are asking themselves the question, why should we have some premises when actually this works quite well? Thank you very much.
And I think a lot of companies are in that mindset at the moment. I mean, Hargreaves Lansdown have come out and they've said they're going to reduce their global office capacity by 15%. You know, as I mentioned earlier in the podcast, you know, the chief exec of Barclays has said he's going to look at moving people into their branches because they need to maintain their branches. And actually, they've got capacity and office space in there that they can use for call center and local workers. And people can work at home as well. WPP, the biggest marketing company, their CEOs come out and said, you know, exactly the same things. I think on the other side of that, one of the things that also has been seen quite a lot of is staff are asking for flexible working arrangements. Well, actually, I've proved I can work at home. I've demonstrated that I'm productive. I've demonstrated that, you know, I've got the capability to do my job. I don't need to be in the office to do it. Therefore, why wouldn't I want to work at home? Because actually it gets rid of an hour's commute either way and bits and pieces. So I think it's there's a lot of people in my organization that definitely still want to continue working flexibly, but there's also a bunch that are clamoring to get back to the office. Now I'm not quite sure whether that's, you know, because the kids and stuff are at home and they just want a break, or whether it's actually you know, they miss the social interaction in the office and those types of things, therefore they want to go back. But I think what we may see is a hybrid as well, where people go in and work in the office a couple of days a week and work at home the rest.
Yeah, I think there's a big mental health aspect to all of this, which I think we mustn't ignore. It's super important, and I think just being with other people is a big part of a lot of people's mental health as well. So we need to make sure that we're accounting properly for that, and whatever choices any organisations make. So yeah, it's certainly learning a lot. But of course, all of this relies on having good encryption, right? So
nice segue.
Very great. Yeah, actually, I think at the beginning I introduced many of Steve's areas of expertise, and I think one thing that deserves a lot of attention here is your knowledge of quantum computing, and we've touched on, you know, the privacy aspect of how we communicate, and I think it's definitely worth going in a bit deeper there. So yeah, I was just wondering if you could sort of talk about the sort of issues surrounding encryption, I guess, to begin with, and we can see from there what else we can discuss.
No worries. So I wouldn't definitely say knowledge. I mean, the physics of this stuff cooks my noodle, that's for sure. And you know, it gets very, very, very complex very, very quickly. And when you start talking about quantum mechanics and these types of things, you know, seriously, I lose interest at that point. That really is dull. For me, anyway, not for quantum scientists, clearly. They'll make a lot of money out of this, and you know, the likes of Brian Cox and co. If you want to know about quantum physics, talk to Brian Cox. All right, that's definitely my advice on that front. He's a lot more interesting than me on that subject. I think the interesting thing with quantum is that it's completely different to classical computing. It's designed to, you know, break very, very difficult mathematical problems that we've got. And as we know today, you know, most encryption is based on significantly difficult mathematical problems that are easy in one direction, but hard in the other, right? So classical encryption, you know, the likes of AES and co work on gated technology, which means you take two numbers, you multiply them together and get an answer. Going back from that number to find out what the two primes were that caused that number in the first place is a huge amount more difficult unless you have a key, right? And that's the basic premise of encryption in reality, is just that. Is the problem's easy one way and very, very difficult the other way, i.e. you need 10,000 years worth of classical computing power in order to break it. So it makes it difficult, or it makes it exceptionally costly to get enough classical computing power, you know, in terms of breaking this stuff. That's where quantum really changes the game, right? Is that it can break these really, really difficult mathematical problems. And it's easy, right? And that's because a processor effectively is an atom. And the difference with classical is that it's 1 or 0. With a quantum computer, it's any state between 1 and 0 at the same time. The other thing is that, things like electrical power requirements for a quantum processor, because they're at almost absolute 0, there's no resistance. So the cost of electricity, for running, say, for instance, a million processors costs about, $1 million in the States in terms of electricity at the moment. To run the same number of quantum processors, just the processors themselves, would be about $25,000 US. So you can see there's a massive difference in electrical cost in terms of running it. The biggest problem is that at the moment, a quantum processor will cost you about $10,000 to buy, right? The whole system to run it, about $10 billion, right? So there's a fairly significant cost in running these things at the moment. So it's very much research establishments, governments, and these types of things.
So before I go and install my tinfoil headgear and sort of run for the hills screaming about my encryption, my understanding of where things have got to, I'd really be interested in your view on this. I mean, it was down to the number of qubits that you could get in a processor, and therefore how realistic it would be to decrypt things like sort of 256-bit keys, right? So my understanding was there was quite a fair gap between the number of bits required and the decryption process for most typical key lengths in
I'll give you some numbers.
Encryption.
I've got some numbers for you. You'll like
Cool.
these.
I like it.
So at the moment, Google's got 72 qubits of processing power, IBM about 53, Intel about 49, and they're what are called universal quantum computers, right? So they'll do unlimited numbers, big as you can ever think of and beyond. However, D-Wave have 2,000 qubits of processing power, but they use something called quantum annealing, which means basically you can only use a finite information set, i.e. the number has to be a finite number. It can't be an infinite number for processing. So according to a number of researchers, Cryptera are one in Canada, to break AES 128, you would need a quantum computer with 2,953 logical qubits. Breaking AES 256, 6,681 qubits, and that's running Grover's algorithm. If you're going to run the Shor algorithm against RSA keys, for a 2048-bit RSA key, you would need 4096 qubits of quantum power.
So not that far.
The biggest problem that you have at the moment is error correction, right?
No,
the estimates
right.
are
Okay.
that you would need somewhere up towards anywhere between 100,000 and a million qubits in order to break AES because of the error correction issues that they've got. It is only a matter of time before somebody gets error correction right. I mean, when you look at a classical computer, I think it's something like 10 to the 29 operations before you get an error. It's a huge number, whereas it's a lot less with a quantum computer. It's very error prone. One stray air molecule in there causes errors. Footsteps down the corridor can cause errors. So it's exceptionally error prone. And there are some people that don't think they'll get there. But then again, you can say that about any form of discovery. There are lots of people saying you won't find a COVID-19 vaccine, right? But as a species, we strive and we will get there. So in lots of cases, what you've got to look at is not the ability to break the encryption. It's largely going to be how long you need to store the data for as to whether you're bothered or not at the moment. You know, they've been saying quantum's been coming for the last 10 years. You know, they're saying it's going to be in the next 10 years, but they've been saying that for the last 10. It's difficult to predict because there's only going to be one singular event where they break the issue of error correction, and the number of processes that they need to break these types of things goes down exponentially. I would suggest, you know, if you're in looking at 25 years data storage that you need for governments or contracts or particular things, yeah, quantum's going to play in that space, and you need to think about the crypto technology that you use. The interesting thing is quantum safe cryptography has been around since the 1970s, right? Even before quantum computers, they had quantum safe cryptography in reality. Problem was, it's very inefficient. It was megabytes rather than bytes or kilobytes. That's changed. You know, there are groups working on it. IBM's working on it. Google's working on it. There are things like lattice-based technology that is quantum resistant that's been put in already, works with TLS 1.2. I think the biggest problem is that it hasn't had the scrutiny and it hasn't had the work on it, and it isn't, you know, understood or actually been tested significantly enough in order for standards bodies to be able to say, yes, it's appropriate to use. And I think that's the biggest problem. I think the research into quantum resistant algorithms takes time. It takes research effort. It takes testing. And that's what we need to be doing now. It's a bit like the old days when MD5 got broken, or when everybody moved from SHA-1 to SHA-256 on certificates. You know, we were late on both of those arenas. We can't afford to be late on this.
It's very interesting. When we were sort of chatting before this, the concept of internet traffic routing was sort of one area we were discussing, and I thought that was a really fascinating point. You know, we might not have a system that will break encryption today, but I was really interested by the point you were making about, you know, if someone changes BGP routing protocol and sort of routes all your traffic via a country that may not have the best interest of your current country at heart, that's something we need to think about, because what's happening to that data?
Well, and that's and that's one of the biggest problems that you've got. You know, in terms of things like BGP, you know, there's very little to zero authentication on it, and it's actually more easy than you would imagine to cause cascade failures and those types of things, populate routes for particular areas in order to push data around the globe, and that was seen, you know, last year with data that was bound for Google US being routed via Nigeria to China. Now, call me kind of cynical, but I, you know, with the advent of quantum and quantum research, you know, we only know that Google's got 72 qubits. We have no idea what governments around the world capability have got within their research institutes already. You know, I find some of these things a little disturbing, if I'm honest, because, you know, routing traffic like that looks like a traffic capture scheme to me, to be able to test something and use it for live data, or store it for later when these solutions become viable. The thing for me is that, you know, if you've got data in there, you know, governments can keep data relevant for very, very long periods of time and under high classification for long periods of time. And, you know, that's important because, you know, operations could be ongoing for many, many, many years. And therefore, you know, encryption is really important. So data that's captured now and stored can then be decrypted when these systems are available. There's lots of speculation. Will they, won't they? Are they actually going to become, you know, a viable solution? My view is that if people think that you can break classic encryption today, like certain governments around the world, they're absolutely going to go after it from an intelligence point of view. Because why wouldn't you? You know, if you're prepared to deploy other intelligence style techniques, why are you not going to invest the money, time, and effort into research to just be able to break encryption?
I'm definitely fashioning myself some Baco foil headgear right now. There's no two ways about it. But I guess there's a sort of an interesting sort of exploration, isn't there? So if you really want to get some data and you've got the capabilities or resources of a nation state, you probably, if you're attacking a commercial organization, I think most of us would argue the vast majority of commercial organizations aren't really cut out to defend against an adversary who is as well resourced as, someone like the GRU, for example, who are very, very capable and very, very good at acquiring information if they really, really want it. And is there sort of, I wonder whether the sort of, I think it's got to be the right topic to be worried about. We should absolutely track it. But I wondered, if they are storing the data, they're probably also doing the other thing, which is going after the thing they really want.
Yeah, I would agree. I think one of the things that you potentially got to look at the long-term stuff of is, is there information in there that people don't want known, right? If you're capturing mass data of a populace, right, it's not just about, actually being able to leverage individuals, within that populace. It's actually about widespread populace control in reality, because you've got a huge amount of data on, potentially browsing habits, potentially what they like, what they do, how they can be influenced, what they're interested in, bank details, points of manipulation that you could use across a populace once you've got that level of data on them. And that's about, citizen control and these types of things. If you take that to the, to the end logical conclusion of why you would potentially want mass data on a populace that they think's encrypted.
Good film recommendation, The Lives of Others. Go and watch that. It's well worth the watch for exactly that reason.
Yeah, I would agree. I think there's definite, government implications, and then there are wider societal implications of people that, maybe don't want, particular proclivities that they've got, those types of things to come out, or spending patterns or browsing history or other things. And it could be used for points of manipulation. And it's not just about the data and this is really the point. It's not just about, breaking data on the fly, which is going to take some time, but it's actually the capture of that data, the storage of that data long term, and then the breaking of it when this technology becomes available. And for me, I think it's a when, not an if.
Yeah, and I think these sorts of questions are kind of what everyone's asking, I guess, in relation to contact tracing. I know. So if not now, yeah.
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting area, isn't it? So you can certainly see a fair amount of debate on that, and which models people are going to go down with that.
Absolutely. Okay, well, Steve, thank you. That was such an absolutely fascinating area of discussion. And I wish we had more time to go in a bit more depth. And I'm sure in the future, perhaps we could delve into some areas a bit more. But that is it for today's episode. Thank you for joining. And I guess in terms of extra content that our listeners may want to kind of dive into, we have an area on our website, resources.digitalshadows.com, where you can find content on the threat model of a remote worker and threats overall, I guess, that companies may be facing in this unusual period. So lots of stuff to get stuck into, and I really appreciate you listening. And then James and Steve, thank you so much for joining me to discuss the subject.
Brilliant. Thanks, Vic.
Thank you.